Now, we've heard the reflections from our panel. We're going to get into the detail by bringing back some of our earlier presenters. So make sure you continue submitting your questions through the live Q&A polls tab to the right of your screen. Firstly, I'd like to welcome back Peter from Neuropower. And Peter, a lot of what the panel were talking about seemed to centre on culture and connection. And interestingly, in our Thinking Beyond report that we published at the end of last year, we heard that over half of those surveyed said that culture had improved with working remotely during the pandemic. But connection is still a big question mark in people's minds, and we've already seen a heap of questions come through from the audience about it. So what are some things that leaders can do in this regard when leading organisations and teams across multiple places and spaces?
Okay, well, I suppose one of the issues here is to have a look at your own mindset as a leader. So if you were to go back to the 70s, it was all about individual performance and individual control. And so we looked at what was the responsibility and what was the authority, and did they line up? Then, more recently, in the 90s, and really for the last 20 years, I suppose, we've been looking at teams, closed teams by and large. So how do you become a coach within the team? Now we're moving to performance networks. This is very different because in performance networks, whereas as in teams, it's about empowerment and control, in performance networks, which is what the panel's been talking about, it's all about transparency and agency. You need to be able to know as a group, as a team, but it's not a fixed team. You could have people coming in and out of the network. And a big concern when you've got a team or an individual, it's how do we make sure that people put their best foot forward and actually perform? The big concern at the beginning of the remote working was, well, aren't people just going to sit at home watching TV through their toes and watching Netflix? The reality is productivity hasn't dropped at all. And in many organisations, it's increased. It's improved. So it's not the motivation we need to have. Instead, it's this understanding, when we talk about these cross-functional teams or cross-functional team of teams or performance networks, what is it that we're trying, what dial are we trying to shift? What are the details? What does performance look like? What does success look like? And then give people the strategy, the autonomy and the transparency so that information in the network, if something isn't working, others can step in and pick up the ball. It's a whole different way of leading and thinking, because the first thing you need to do is define the performance network. It's not a static team. And then you need to have an induction into that network. You need to have rituals and methodologies so that people can feel as though the contribution they're making is valued and drawing on people's strengths. Now, it could be that network can never get together face-to-face. So you need to think of creative ways of people being able to share their aspirational self as well as their functional self, and to have periods of time where people can talk about their lives and what they're doing and can connect so that we get that trust factor right. So from a leadership perspective, these are very different phases requiring different skills and different mindsets. And this team of teams, cross-functional performance network way of thinking is a very different way of thinking.
Thanks, Peter. And I have to say, I am definitely one of those people who has got the balance right between being productive and binging on plenty of trashy reality TV. But I'm joined here in the studio by some of our experts, and I'd like to bring you in at this point, Jeremy, because a lot of what you talk about provides some really important context to this discussion. And one of the questions that was pre-submitted was around the experiences across different states and territories, because we're seeing some CBDs more active and vibrant than others. So what are the factors that impact this, and what do you think will actually drive people back to working in the CBDs?
Well, in the short term, obviously, lockdowns were the critical driver, and we've seen, obviously, Melbourne CBD's taken longer to recover than the others, but Sydney's been more hard hit as well. But fundamentally, how many people have the types of jobs that can be done remotely is the key driver that we've seen. But we do think they will come back, because it might not be the same people that come back, but other people are going to come back into the city. There's a real conception of a static, unevolving city, and I think we're going to see that that's just not true.
Yeah, well, I might give you a bit of a follow-up question there, because I know you're a hard numbers man, but I'm going to ask you to hazard a guess. And coming from you, it's going to be a pretty informed guess. But do you think that in, say, 2 years' time, we're going to see CBDs back to being their old vibrant selves?
I think they'll be back to being a different vibrant self. I think that's the key. The old is the old. I'm old enough to think back to the last recession, and the city changed as a result of that. We had holes in the ground. We don't have holes in the ground here. We have vacant floors, and they will fill with a different type of organisation.
Yeah, that's great. So I might now, Avodia, go to you joining us from Melbourne. You spoke earlier about how people are using the office differently and how the look and feel and design of that office needs to change. What do you think is the role of smart buildings and property technology within all of this?
It's really interesting to have listened to this conversation so far, and throughout all of the themes that were addressed and talked about, the one consistent theme that came up was the role of technology. And absolutely, technology is going to be an enabler of the decisions that businesses make about the types of workplaces that they want to create, in terms of spatial, physical workplaces, but also in terms of how they enable their people and their organisations. So I'm seeing that for the approach to technology would be about really focusing on what is that consistent experience that an organisation wants to achieve. How is it going to enable equity in this new hybrid world, both for individuals as well as for teams in how they work, how they choose to work, how they connect, and when and where they get their work done. And then how is technology going to enable the sharing of knowledge, for example, across larger organisations, particularly global organisations. And then ultimately, when we look at our buildings and the workspaces themselves, there's a lot of talk about using data more smartly, or thinking about building technologies that can really create a more fluid experience for people. So I think there'll probably be quite a bit that we see in that space around touchless operations at one end, the collecting of data and the understanding of how spaces are utilised, and what the occupancy rates are that we're seeing, how people are engaging with spaces and with each other. So there's a raft of things that will come out that will really inform the workplaces that we continue to create. I think, though, to wrap all of that together, I think in essence, technology is an enabler, and it warrants a conversation as big as a conversation that we've had just about the future of work in itself. It really needs to be considered strategically for each organisation, and how it contributes to all of the other areas that we've talked about today.
And Avodia, while I have you, I've just got another question that's come through from Amy, because I think that what we're hearing is there's a sentiment out there that there's a lot of conversation, but what are we actually doing about it? We've heard that maybe it's a bit too early to start doing things about it because we still don't know all the answers. But Amy wants to know, what are we seeing from organisations who are actually taking this seriously and listening to employees when it comes to the design of their workplace?
Oh, it's a wonderful opportunity now to really be experimental. So Dom earlier talked about really failing fast, taking a risk and really experimenting with new ways of working. So we're seeing with many organisations that have these empty floors, for example, because not everyone's come back to the workplace, to really set up pilot schemes or prototyping opportunities to really test new ways of working, new protocols within teams of how they work, when they're in, how they connect with each other, that balance of synchronous and asynchronous work and all the systems around that support it. So there's an opportunity, a real opportunity here to test, to experiment, to learn from, and then using all of that intelligence to inform longer-term decisions. The reality is that no one really has the answer for the long term in terms of workplace, and it's really great that we are open to acknowledging that firstly, and then secondly, have this wonderful opportunity to test and trial new things.
Thanks, Avodia. And we're going to take a slightly different tact now, because there are a few questions that came through with the registrations, Bryony, that were all about some of the industrial relations issues that you spoke about, including one from my mum, which was, when can Ben move back to Perth? Mum will take that offline. But one of the questions was, what things can we expect to flow into employee agreements and awards that reflect this shift towards hybrid working?
Yeah, good question. We've actually already seen things really flowing into awards. So our Fair Work Commission was pretty responsive during COVID, at the height of COVID, in making amendments to some of our most commonly applying awards in order to take into account, for example, for clerical workers, the fact that people were working from home a lot more, which might then, and you might recall that I said in the earlier spot that different hours have different costs. So what a lot of those changes did, for example, was shift the boundaries of the span of work of ordinary hours to reduce the instance at which overtime might have been worked. So, in other words, somebody could be working after 7 o'clock at night. Ordinarily, that would have attracted overtime hours. Under changes, there was more flexibility to allow for a shift in change of when people could work, because the Commission anticipated that people would be working from home. Off the back of that, the Commission actually itself went out and commissioned research to understand moving forward, because all of those changes were temporary, to understand what other changes might be required and how businesses, both large and small, were intending to work into the future. And their research showed that a lot of the clerical sort of service employers or employers employing those people had in mind that they would continue to have some kind of flexibility moving into the future. So I think we will see more of that. In terms of the way that awards are structured, more flexibility around the hours that people are working and also where they might be working. From a contractual perspective, so obviously a lot of employers employ people who are covered by awards and other industrial instruments that hang off those, like enterprise agreements. We also have a lot of office-based knowledge workers who work on common law contracts. I think what we'll continue to see with those contracts is flexibility. So a lot of employers reached out to their employees during COVID, initially as a pressure valve mechanism to really sort of, agree to more flexible hours, remuneration models, etc. I think we'll see that continued flexibility moving forward, particularly again in terms of where people are working and the like. I think, my hope is that when we're moving forward to making those change in industrial instruments and in contracts, that we do that in a way, though, that retains flexibility moving forward, because I think we've seen in the last 12 months that things can change pretty rapidly. And we're lucky that we had a very responsive commission during that period of time, and that we also had, employer groups and employee groups working together for those changes. But I think we've got to keep that flexibility in mind.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the point you made earlier in the webcast as well, around not rushing into making any choices, so you can maintain that flexibility rather than locking yourself in. I'm keen to now hear from everyone's favourite super friend, Margot. Because when you and Sharon were talking earlier, a lot of what you were talking about was about how wellbeing's been thrust into the spotlight, and particularly things that organisations can do when it comes to looking after the wellbeing and mental health of their people. But for the people who are watching on the broadcast, a lot of who are, or arguably all of who are leaders, what can individuals do to ensure the mental health and wellbeing of their people? What things can they proactively do and steps that they can take around managing the welfare of their people when they can't physically see them?
I think that's a great question, because it's certainly something that in this hybrid environment we're going to need to adjust to permanently. It's not just a short-term thing that leaders need to lean into. I'd be suggesting to leaders that part of it is around creating that sense of connectedness and culture within a culture of care within their workforce. And that starts with the meetings. That starts with the interactions that we have, whether that's in person or virtually, and the nature of our questions, really investing in being able to have questions and answers and sit and listen and hear how people's, emotions, how the morale is up and down within the team, and really respond to that. And that to me speaks to how do we as employers equip our leaders so that every interaction, every moment, every day is about the wellbeing of their people. It's not just left for HR, people and culture, or work health and safety, but this becomes a whole of business, part of the culture of care, part of the DNA of leadership that we're going to absolutely need into the future. So I'd be encouraging leaders, if you're not comfortable having those conversations, what could you be doing to educate yourself? How do you build skills and capability across your workforce so that people can put up their hand and say, hey, look, I'm feeling like I am going to kill the dog, or I'm, not coping in this environment, or that I am really loving this and I want to do more of this. So we've heard today just so many different elements that I think speak to the complex construct of which workplace mental health is. It's the environment, it's the leadership, it's the capability, it's the culture, it's that sense of belonging and connectedness. They're all the elements that as a leader of tomorrow we need to be on the front foot, working with our people, not to them, but with our people, and co-designing how that actually works to get the business benefit and the social and emotional benefit.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Margot. Look, we'll have to leave it there, but can I just say that it's been a real pleasure working with all of you in pulling this report together, and again to have you as part of our Q&A. So to Peter and Evodia, Jeremy, Bryony and Margot, thank you so much for your time. Well, that's a wrap for today. Thanks to everyone who joined us for the launch of our report, Changing Places. And to our panellists and report contributors, thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. If you'd like to read about the future of work and get more detail on the topics raised today, please take a look at the Changing Places report that's available to download from the Content tab.
I'm excited to see how the future of work unfolds in Australia and how we can lead the conversation and lead the design of healthy, wealthy, well and high-performing workplaces, workforces and experiences. To make it work, we need to reconsider the role and design of the office, reevaluate well-being, rethink our obligations and reimagine leadership. And it demands a joined-up, whole-of-organisation effort that learns the lessons of the recent past while not being constrained by them. The opportunity for Australian organisations now is to embrace it and co-create a future of work that's better for everyone. Thank you and goodbye.